Korean Mafia boss pretends to be in a coma, but when he hears his nurse's confession, everything changes. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic, metronomic beeping of the cardiac monitor were the only constants in a world that had shrunk to the four walls of a VIP hospital suite. To the outside world, Jae-sun was a fallen titan, a casualty of a brutal ambush that had left the formidable head of the Gwangju Syndicate in a vegetative state, powerless and drifting in the void. But the truth was far more calculated. His mind was a razor in the dark, sharp and waiting. He had trained for years in the discipline of stillness, slowing his breath until it was barely a ghost of a respiration, keeping his heart rate artificially low, and enduring the humiliation of being discussed as if he were already a corpse. He lay there, paralyzed by choice, listening to the vultures circle his empire. The suite was luxurious, filled with flowers he couldn't smell and cards he wouldn't read, but it was a prison nonetheless, monitored by cameras and guarded by men whose loyalty was currently up for auction. The door clicked open, the heavy sound of expensive Oxfords hitting the linoleum floor signaling the arrival of the very men he had once called brothers. Sang-woo, his second in command, entered with the arrogance of a man who had already tried on the crown and found it fitting. Accompanying him was Director Cho, the syndicate's legal counsel, a man whose voice dripped with the slippery cadence of corporate betrayal. Jae-sun kept his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, practiced rhythm of the comatose. He could feel their presence looming over the bed, the heat of their ambition radiating in the cool air. They spoke freely, stripped of the coded language they used in public, confident that the man in the bed was nothing more than a husk. Sang-woo laughed, a sound that lacked all mirth, noting how easy the transition had been, how the lower captains had fallen in line once they believed Jae-sun was brain dead. They discussed the timeline for the final acquisition, a restructuring of the organization's legitimate shipping fronts that would wash away Jae-sun's legacy and replace it with a hollow, profit-driven shell. The vote was scheduled for the end of the week, a mere formality that required only the official declaration of Jae-sun's permanent incapacity. Every word they spoke was a dagger. But Jae-sun did not flinch. He merely filed the information away, building a mental dossier of treason that he would execute with extreme prejudice when the moment was right. The atmosphere in the room shifted when the evening shift began, the heavy, oppressive energy of the conspirators replaced by a different kind of presence. The door opened again, softly this time, accompanied by the squeak of rubber-soled shoes. It was the night nurse, Keisha. She was a 24-year-old African-American woman who moved with a quiet, efficient grace that Jae-sun had come to recognize over the last 3 weeks. She wore light blue scrubs that rustled softly as she checked the monitors and adjusted the 4-drip with a gentleness that was entirely foreign to the violent world Jae-sun inhabited. Unlike the other staff, who treated him like a piece of broken furniture or an inconvenient workload, Keisha spoke to him. She narrated her actions, explaining that she was changing his fluids or adjusting his pillows, maintaining his dignity even when he could not demand it himself. Jae-sun had observed her through the narrowest slits of his eyelids when the room was dim, noting the exhaustion in her posture and the determined set of her jaw. She was not part of the game. She was a civilian, an innocent bystander in a war zone she didn't know existed. On this particular night, however, the routine was different. Keisha did not just check the charts. She lingered by the bedside, her hand resting lightly on the railing near his arm. The room was silent save for the machines, and when she spoke, her voice was a trembling whisper, thick with fear and a heavy moral burden. She leaned in close, checking the door to ensure they were alone. "I know you can't hear me," Keisha whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "But I have to say it out loud, or I'm going to lose my mind. I know what they're doing to you." Jae-sun's internal focus sharpened instantly. This was the confession. "I saw the new orders Director Cho filed," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of anxiety. "They changed your medication schedule. The dosage they want me to give you tomorrow. It's not for recovery. It's a sedative overdose masked as a therapeutic adjustment. They aren't waiting for you to die natural, sir. They're going to stop your heart on Friday morning before the board meeting." She paused, a stifled sob escaping her throat. "And I don't know who to tell because the head doctor signed off on it. If I speak up, I lose my license, maybe worse. But letting them kill you, I can't have that on my soul." The revelation hit Jae-sun with the force of a physical blow. The timeline had accelerated. Friday morning was the execution date. He had assumed they would let him rot, but Sang-woo was impatient and Cho was thorough. They were going to medically assassinate him to ensure the transfer of power was seamless. But amidst the sudden surge of adrenaline, Jae-sun realized something vital. Keisha was not just a witness. She was a variable the conspirators had failed to account for. She possessed a conscience in a building void of one. Her confession wasn't just an unburdening, it was an opportunity. He realized that his strategy of passive observation was no longer viable. If he remained the silent statue, he would be dead in 48 hours. He needed an operator on the outside, someone who could move through the hospital corridors invisible and unsuspected. He needed Keisha. The risk was immense. If she panicked, if she screamed, the guards outside the door would rush in, and his advantage would be lost. But as she leaned over to adjust his blanket, her face inches from his, he knew he had no choice. He had to break his silence. The next morning brought a fresh wave of indignity and danger. The sun had barely crested the skyline when the entourage returned, this time bringing the institutional enabler, Dr. Reeves. Reeves was a man of weak chin and weaker morals, his white coat a costume of authority that barely concealed his greed. Jae-sun lay motionless as Reeves performed a cursory examination, pressing cold metal instruments against Jae-sun's chest while ignoring the patient entirely to speak to Sang-woo. "The decline is proceeding as anticipated," Reeves lied, his voice smooth and practiced. "We expect the final system's failure to occur naturally within the next 2 days." "The paperwork is already prepared for the coroner," Sang-woo nodded, looking at Jae-sun's face with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. "Good. The board needs a clean break." No lingering questions, they stood at the foot of the bed, discussing the murder of the man right in front of them, shielded by the arrogance of their power. Keisha was in the room, standing in the corner with a tray of medications. Jae-sun could feel her tension. It radiated off her like heat. When Reeves ordered her to prepare a specific injection, a precursor to the lethal cocktail they planned for Friday, she hesitated. "Doctor," Keisha said, her voice steady, but laced with underlying steel. "This dosage is contraindicated with his current beta blockers. It could cause severe bradycardia." It was a brave move, a technical objection thrown up as a shield. Reeves spun on her, his eyes narrowing. "I am the attending physician, nurse. You are here to follow orders, not to audit my prescriptions. Administer the dose, or I will have you removed from this floor immediately." The threat was clear. Sang-woo watched the exchange with bored amusement, unaware that the young woman holding the syringe was the only thing standing between him and total victory. Keisha lowered her eyes, appearing to submit, but Jae-sun noticed her sleight of hand. As she approached the 4 line, she manipulated the stopcock. She injected the fluid, but she had closed the valve to his vein. The medicine pooled harmlessly in the tube, blocked from entering his system. She had saved him, right in front of their eyes. That night, the hospital settled into the eerie quiet of the 3rd shift. The guards outside were lax, lulled into complacency by weeks of inactivity. Inside the room, the lights were dimmed to a low amber glow. Keisha was checking the vitals monitor, her back to the bed, her shoulders slumped with the weight of the day's deception. She was trapped, complicit in a murder she was desperately trying to stall, terrified that her small act of rebellion with the 4 line would be discovered. She jumped when she heard the sound, not a machine beep, but the friction of sheets moving. She turned around, her eyes widening in shock. Jae-sun had turned his head. His eyes were open, dark and lucid, locking onto hers with an intensity that froze the scream in her throat. "Do not make a sound," Jason said. His voice was raspy from disuse, scraping like gravel, but it commanded absolute authority. Keisha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, stumbling back until she hit the wall.
"You."
"You're awake," she whispered, her eyes darting to the door. "You've been awake." Jason slowly raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. "I heard you last night, Keisha," he said, using her name with deliberate familiarity. "I heard your confession, and I saw what you did with the four today. You saved my life." He pushed himself up slightly, the muscles trembling but obeying his command. "They plan to kill me on Friday. You know this. And I know that you are the only person in this building who hasn't been bought." Keisha was shaking, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know what to do. They're powerful men. If they know you're awake, they'll kill us both right now." "That is exactly why they cannot know," Jason replied, his gaze unwavering. "Not yet. I need your help, Keisha. I cannot move freely, but you can. You are the invisible woman. They see a nurse. They see furniture. They don't see a threat." He beckoned her closer. She hesitated, terrified, but the moral clarity that had compelled her to confess the night before pulled her toward him. She approached the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Jason's expression hardened into the look of a general surveying a battlefield. "I need eyes and ears. I need proof. Director Cho carries a tablet. He records everything for leverage. Sangwoo uses a burner phone for the off-book orders. I need you to be my spy." It was an impossible request, asking a 24-year-old nurse to infiltrate a Mafia conspiracy, but as she looked at the man who had fought his way back from the brink of death, she realized there was no neutral ground left. She nodded slowly. The alliance was formed. The following day, the atmosphere in the VIP suite transformed from a waiting room for death into a covert operations center. The transformation was invisible to the naked eye. To anyone watching on the security feed, it looked like standard patient care. Keisha moved with her usual efficiency, but every action now had a dual purpose. When she changed the bedding, she whispered updates on the guard rotations. When she checked the IVs, she received instructions on what specific phrases to listen for. Jason, though still physically weak, was mentally accelerating, guiding her through the treacherous waters of corporate espionage. He taught her how to look without turning her head, how to leave a recording app running on her phone while it sat innocuously on a medication cart. The first test of their partnership came just hours later. Director Cho arrived alone, pacing the room while on a call, his voice low and agitated. "The offshore accounts need to be ready by Friday noon," he hissed into his phone. "Once the flatline is confirmed, we transfer the assets immediately. I don't care about the encryption keys. We bypass them with the death certificate." Keisha was in the room, emptying the waste bin. Her heart thundered in her ears. Loud enough, she feared, to be picked up by the microphone. She had placed her phone on the counter behind Cho, the screen dark, but the recorder running. She moved slowly, fighting the urge to flee. Cho turned, his eyes sweeping over her dismissively before returning to the window. "Yes, the nurse is irrelevant. Just get it done." He ended the call and left, leaving the phone behind on the counter for a split second before scooping it up, but he missed Keisha's phone. As soon as the door clicked shut, Keisha retrieved her device, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She rushed to the bedside, playing the audio back for Jason. The quality was crisp. It was a smoking gun, a direct admission of premeditated murder and financial fraud. Jason listened, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "Perfect," he whispered. This is the first nail in their coffin, but the recording was only one piece of the puzzle. To dismantle them completely, he needed to know the full extent of the network. He needed to know who on the board had betrayed him. "We have the method," Jason said, his voice stronger now. "Now we need the roster. Tonight, you need to get into the nurse's station computer. Access Dr. Reeves' private files. He documents his special consultations. That list will tell me who I need to destroy and who I can spare. Keisha looked at him, fear still present but now tempered by a rising sense of purpose. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the right hand of the boss, and they were going to take back the kingdom. The hallway outside the nurse's station was bathed in the sickly, flickering fluorescent light that characterized the graveyard shift, a stark contrast to the shadowed intimacy of the VIP suite where a mafia boss and a nurse plotted a revolution. Keisha stood at the precipice of the corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she clutched a clipboard to her chest, using it as a shield against the creeping dread. It was 3 a.m., the dead hour, the time when human error was most likely and when the hospital's skeletons were buried in digital graves. Jae-sun had been precise in his instructions, his mind dissecting the hospital's security protocols with the same ruthless efficiency he used to dismantle rival gangs. He needed the ledger, Dr. Reeves' private consultation log, which Jae-sun suspected was a thinly veiled record of bribes and illicit prescriptions. Keisha approached the main terminal, her hands trembling as she reached for the keyboard. The login screen blinked at her, a blue cursor pulsing like a taunt. Earlier that day, under the guise of organizing Reeves' desk, she had placed a piece of clear tape over his keyboard, later dusting it with crushed chalk from the supply closet to see which keys were pressed, a trick Jae-sun had whispered to her from his bed. The pattern suggested a date. She typed it in. The date of Reeves' medical board certification. Access granted. The screen flooded with data, casting a ghostly pallor over her face as she navigated the labyrinth of folders. She found it buried under a directory labeled Archived Research, a spreadsheet titled External Revenue. It was a roadmap of corruption, detailing payments from Sangwoo shell companies directly into Reeves' offshore accounts, with line items explicitly referencing subject JS termination. As the file transferred to the encrypted USB drive Jae-sun had guided her to locate in his personal effects, hidden in the lining of his suit jacket hanging in the closet, the elevator chimed at the end of the hall. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. Keisha froze, her eyes darting to the progress bar. 85%. Footsteps echoed, heavy and deliberate, not the squeak of nursing shoes, but the thud of security boots. It was the private contractor hired by Sangwoo to monitor the floor. Keisha couldn't run. That would imply guilt. She forced herself to breathe, willing her posture to relax into the slump of a tired employee catching up on paperwork. The guard rounded the corner, his gaze sweeping over her with suspicion. Late night for filing, isn't it? He grunted, his hand resting casually near his belt. Keisha didn't flinch, channeling the icy composure Jae-sun had modeled for her. Dr. Reeves needs these charts audited before the board meeting tomorrow, she lied, her voice steady despite the nausea churning in her stomach. Unless you want to explain to him why his audit is incomplete? The guard hesitated, the mention of Reeves and his notorious temper, enough to make him back down. He grunted an affirmation and continued his patrol. The drive flashed, complete. She yanked it free, slid it into her pocket, and walked away with the casual pace of someone who had nothing to hide while carrying the evidence that would topple an empire. Thursday dissolved into Friday with an agonizing slowness, the hours ticking down toward the execution scheduled for 9 a.m. The atmosphere in the suite was suffocating, a pressure cooker of unspoken tension. To the outside world, Jae-sun was fading. His monitors were calibrated to show a gradual decline in vital signs, a digital deception orchestrated by Keisha's manipulation of the sensor leads. But inside the bed, Jae-sun was coiled like a viper. He had spent the last 24 hours mentally rehearsing every variable, consuming the data Keisha had stolen. The scope of the betrayal was wider than he had anticipated. It wasn't just a coup, it was a liquidation. Sangwoo had arranged to sell the syndicate's shipping routes to a Russian conglomerate immediately upon Jae-sun's death, a deal that would flood the streets with product Jae-sun had strictly forbidden. The moral stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about his survival, but about preventing a chaotic flood of violence that would engulf the city. Keisha moved around the room, performing her final checks, but her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. They had made contact with the one external variable Jason could trust, Attorney Kong, a man of archaic honor who had been pushed out by Director Cho, but never fired. Through a burner email accessed on the hospital Wi-Fi, they had sent the encrypted files. The reply had been a single word. Received now. They just had to survive the morning. You have to leave the room when they come, Jason whispered during her morning rounds, his voice barely audible over the hum of the HVAC. If things go wrong, I do not want you in the crossfire. Keisha shook her head, adjusting his blanket with fierce determination.
No.
I'm the nurse. I have to be here to administer the final dose if I leave. Reeves does it himself, and he won't hesitate. I'm staying. It was a defiance that Jason respected, a sign that the civilian had forged herself into a soldier in the span of 3 days. He didn't argue. He simply closed his eyes as the heavy oak doors swung open. The air in the room changed instantly, soured by the arrival of Sang-woo, Director Cho, and Dr. Reeves. They wore dark suits, dressed for a funeral they were eager to attend. There was no pretense of sorrow today, only the impatient energy of men checking a box on a to-do list. Time of death will be recorded as 9:15 a.m., Reeves stated clinically, opening a silver case on the rolling table. He withdrew a syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid, potassium chloride, enough to stop a heart instantly. Heart failure secondary to trauma complications.
Clean.
Simple, Sang-woo stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the man who had been his mentor, his face devoid of anything but greed. Do it, Sang-woo commanded. The buyers are waiting. The moment stretched, elastic and terrifying. Dr. Reeves stepped forward, the needle glinting under the harsh overhead lights. Keisha stood by the monitor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, waiting for the signal. Reeves swabbed the injection port on the foreline, the smell of alcohol sharp and stinging. Goodbye, boss, Sang-woo muttered, checking his watch. As Reeves' thumb depressed the plunger, ready to push the lethal dose into the line, the rhythm of the heart monitor did not slow. It accelerated. A steady, powerful thumping filled the room, faster and stronger than a dying man's heart should ever be. Reeves paused, confused, looking up at the screen. In that split second of hesitation, the hand that had lain motionless for weeks shot up. Jason's fingers clamped around Reeves' wrist with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. The doctor yelped, dropping the syringe, which clattered loudly onto the linoleum. The room froze. Sang-woo took a step back, his face draining of color. Jason slowly opened his eyes, and the fog of the coma was gone, replaced by a burning, terrifying clarity. He sat up, the movement fluid and controlled, ignoring the wires that pulled at his chest. He didn't look at the doctor wincing in his grip. His eyes were locked on his second-in-command. You are always impatient, Sang-woo, Jason said, his voice rough but booming, filling the silence with command. And you, Cho, were always sloppy. The shock in the room was palpable, a physical force that pinned the conspirators to the floor.
He's
awake, Cho stammered, backing toward the door.
Guard.
Get the guard. But the door didn't open for his mercenaries. It opened for Attorney Kong, flanked by 4 officers from the Internal Investigations Unit and the Chief of Police himself. The tableau was complete. Jason released Reeves, shoving him backward into the medical cart with a crash. There is no need for guards, Jason continued, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The police have the recording of you ordering my murder, Cho. And they have the bank records you thought were secure. He pointed to Keisha, who stepped forward, no longer the terrified nurse, but the witness for the prosecution. She handed a tablet to the chief of police, who tapped the screen. Ko's voice, clear and undeniable, filled the room from the recording days prior. Once the flat line is confirmed, we transfer the assets immediately. The color drained from Sang-woo's face as he realized the depth of the trap. He wasn't watching a man die, he was watching his own life end. The unraveling was swift and brutal, not in violence, but in the cold machinery of justice. There was no shootout, no desperate struggle. Jason had ensured that their power was stripped before they could reach for a weapon. The officers moved in, cuffing Dr. Reeves first, who began to weep and babble about being coerced. Director Cho maintained a stony silence, the lawyer in him already calculating odds that no longer existed. But it was the interaction between Jae-sun and Sang-woo that held the room's oxygen. The betrayed mentor stood before the usurper, looking down at him with a disappointment that cut deeper than any knife. "You wanted the crown," Jae-sun said quietly, "but you didn't want the weight. You thought leadership was about profit. It is about people." Sang-woo looked at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had tried to kill. "It was just business," he whispered, a pathetic epitaph for his ambition. "No," Jae-sun corrected him, glancing at Keisha, who stood tall by the window. "It was a test. And you failed." As they were led away, the hospital room felt suddenly spacious, the oppressive air of conspiracy vented out, leaving only the sterile, clean scent of a new beginning. Jae-sun turned to Keisha. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a bow, deep and respectful, acknowledging that the hierarchy had been irrelevant in the face of her courage. "You saved more than my life today," he told her. "You saved the soul of this organization." 6 months later, the skyline of the city gleamed under a bright autumn sun, a visual echo of the clarity that had been restored to the Gwangju Syndicate. The organization had been purged, the criminal elements excised, and the legitimate shipping logistics expanded into a transparent, lawful enterprise. Jason sat in his office, not a shadowy den of smoke and whispers, but a glass-walled room overlooking the harbor. He looked different, older, perhaps, with silver threading his hair, but lighter. He signed the final papers for the Keisha Williams Medical Scholarship Foundation, a massive endowment designed to fund nursing and medical degrees for underprivileged students. Across the city, Keisha walked out of the medical school admissions office, a letter of acceptance in her hand. She wasn't just a survivor of the incident. She was its greatest victory. She stopped to check her phone, seeing a news notification. Syndicate reforms lead to record low crime rates. She smiled, knowing the truth behind the headline. She met Jae-sun one last time at a quiet park by the river. It was a meeting of equals. They didn't speak of the fear or the syringe or the dark nights in the hospital room. They spoke of the future. "You have a long road ahead, Doctor," Jae-sun said, using the title she had not yet earned but surely would. "And you have a lot of cleaning up left to do," she replied, gesturing to the city. "The network Cho used," she added, her tone turning serious. "The money didn't stop with him. I saw the last page of the ledger before I gave it to the police. There were transfers to a consortium in Zurich." Cho was just a middleman. Jae-sun nodded, his expression darkening slightly, the warrior re-emerging behind the CEO's mask. "I know. We cut off the head of the snake, but the body is still moving in the tall grass. That is a battle for tomorrow." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude that words could not capture. "But today," he said, "we enjoy the peace we bought." As Keisha walked away into the sunlight, and Jae-sun turned back toward the city that was both his kingdom and his burden, the camera lingered on the space between them, a bond forged in silence, proving that even in the darkest corridors of power, the truth has a sound of its own.